Hi there, my name is Nils with Learn to DIY, and in this video I'll be showing you how to build a floating deck. Now today I'm going to be showing you what's called a floating deck or a detached deck. That simply means that it's not attached to your home, and this is the perfect kind of deck for gatherings in the backyard. Now one nice thing about building a deck like this is you can do so with a fairly small set of tools. Really, to do this we just used a circular saw, a jigsaw to do any shaping and things like that. A miter saw is another option. It's not required, but if you have a circular saw that's usually enough. And then we used a drill to do all the fastening and everything. So with those basic tools you can really do this entire thing. Another nice thing about building a floating deck is you can really make it any shape you want. As you can see in this particular one, I followed the curve of the rock wall, and I really like the way that turned out. You may just be building a square deck or a rectangular deck, and that's totally fine too. That actually definitely simplifies the process, but you can really make this any shape you want, especially by using a jigsaw to custom shape the ends. Now I'll be walking you through each of the steps involved in building this floating deck, starting with your planning, and then moving from there to your tough blocks or your foundation, as well as framing and leveling, and then we'll finish it off with our decking material. In this case I went with Trex, but pressure treated lumber or any decking material will do. Now be sure to stay tuned till the end, where I'll be talking about the 3 biggest takeaways I got from building this deck and things that I think you'll appreciate knowing.
Now in my case, I'm working with a raised terrace here to build the deck on. And the first thing we're going to look at with planning is getting some measurements. So, as you can see here, I wanted to do a deck that took up pretty much this entire space, so I got my measurements front to back, side to side, and I did my best to calculate the area as well. Once I had the general layout in my mind, I took a look at where the footings would go. In this case, I'm using what are called tough blocks, which are basically plastic foundation blocks that can be placed directly on the ground. Now they do need to be placed within 4 feet 11 inches or 1.5 meters of one another. The idea here is to get a feel for how many blocks you're going to need and how much lumber you're going to need to complete the project. Once you've got that figured out, our next step is to figure out the wrapping. In my case, I chose to go with Trex decking. Keep an eye out in your local classifieds for people that ended up abandoning projects or had extra. I purchased mine for $15 a board rather than $30 brand new. The first thing I did is I took my 2x6 pressure treated boards and laid them out. I purchased these in multiple lengths to limit the amount of waste material I would have on each board. And that way I was able to lay everything out to get a visual feel for what it would look like first. Next I had to get the exact curvature that I wanted for the front of the deck, and so I settled on using an air hose, which is probably not the most high-tech solution here, but it did the job. Basically I adjusted until I got it to the right place and followed that arc of the wall, and then I scribed along each board the exact angle that they needed to be cut at. Once I had the line marked on each board, I brought them one by one over to the chop saw, adjusted the angle of the chop saw to match the line, and made my cut. Once those cuts were made, I was able to cut out the 14.5-inch spacers that go in between each board, and I typically needed 2 for each section because of the length being covered. With the boards cut, it's time for assembly, so be sure to use galvanized or outdoor rated nails to do this, and then it's just a matter of dropping everything into place for those 16 inches on center joists. Now with the framing all put together, I realized that that top right corner that you're seeing was actually a little bit higher up than the bottom left, and so I wanted to give things a little bit more of a fair chance to stay level, so I dug out some of the earth underneath that just to make things a little bit easier for these next steps. And with that, the framing was all complete and I was ready to put the foundation underneath it. To do so, we lifted the whole wall up and then started laying out the tough blocks. I used spray paint to spray lines of where the joists would go, carried the tough blocks over, and then spread them out as per the designs that I had, making sure to maintain that maximum distance between each one. And then my son helped me lower the deck back into place, and it didn't fare so well in that process, so I did reinforce everything with screws rather than nails afterwards because I found that worked a lot better. I then took 2 16-foot boards, this is what I was going to use for leveling, and then I added joist hangers to the back wall where it connected each joist to the main beam. Then I just had a lot of cleaning up and fastening to do to make sure everything was sturdy and in place. I used clamps to overcome any twisting or warpage that happened in the boards, and then started making my 4x4 cuts for the posts. Now these are the posts that actually sit inside the tough block and allow us to adjust the height of the deck which is what allows you to create a level deck on uneven ground. As you can see, I just actually used a car jack with a level to get that perfectly flat, and then once I had that in place, it's just a matter of taking measurements. So basically the idea here is you take a measurement from the bottom of the tuff block to the top of the deck once you've gotten it level, and then you cut your post to that size, and I always recommend cutting off about a ½ inch off of that in case you need to do some adjustments. You definitely don't want to have to cut down that post after you've attached it to the deck. From there, you go around and attach each of those posts in place, and as you go, you'll notice that the deck gets more and more stable. Now I went with the pattern of driving 4 3-inch screws into each one. These are outdoor rated, very sturdy screws, and I was sure to apply as much body weight as I could to the posts as I screwed them in, and the end result was a very sturdy footing. Now with everything looking level side to side, be sure to check your level front and back as well. And once everything is level, you can then go around and attach all of the rest of the pillars, and you'll just watch as this thing becomes more and more solid each post you add. Now with our tuff blocks in place, with the framing attached very securely and everything made nice and level, this framing is ready to go. Now this would be an appropriate time to pat yourself on the back, sit in the shade, and enjoy the work you've done because you have now completed step 2 of 3 of building this deck. Now with the framing complete, we're ready to take a look at the next step. This is our final step, which is adding the decking material. To start, add one full-size piece in a corner, and then use a framing square to make sure you get that perfectly perpendicular to your joists. This is crucial on this first board. Next, you'll make a cut on the center of the joist, and then you'll bring in your next board. Be sure to cut off that manufactured end, lay it in, and then when you're ready, you can either trim that off, or if you have additional boards to go, you can add those at this time. Now when you're laying out the first board of each row, you'll want to leave a little overhang on that right side, which you can remove later. And we're going to place another full-size board, and this time we're going to cut it in the middle, again centering that cut on a joist. Then we'll place another full-size board on, and this one we'll leave as full as possible. Make that end cut just like we did on the first row, and then you can put on your last piece for the row. At this point, it's really just wash, rinse, repeat. We're going to create that same pattern, a long one, then a short one, a long one, then a short one, and you want to make sure to stagger those joints in between your boards every other row, just like you see here. Another pattern you can go with is what's called a staircase pattern, where you move the joints over one joist at a time, creating a staircase look. Now with the entire deck covered in your boarding, it's time to trim everything off with either a jigsaw or a circular saw, and then lastly we're going to wrap the outside with fascia. This will complete the entire deck, and let's take a look at some of the tips along the way. Now the first tip is to clear the vegetation underneath. In my case, I treated all of the grass under there, and then I laid down a thick barrier of weed barrier to make sure that nothing grows up between my boards later on. Next, when it comes to cutting the ends of the boards, you can use a speed square to create a perfect perpendicular cut every time. The other convenient thing about this is you can do this in place, so you don't have to pre-cut your boards, and then set it right on that center of the joist. Now one really important aspect of decking is consistent spacing. I put together a very simple little spacer here just using some MDF and some 1/8 inch plywood, and that does the job as long as you're using the same thing every time and you have manufacturer recommended specs as far as the gapping there. I also highly recommend toenailing in and pre-drilling every screw that goes into the ends of the boards. That helps with preventing any cracking or splitting that might occur. For the screws, I purchased some decking screws that have a couple of really cool features. One, they have a very thin and almost unnoticeable head on them, and second, they have some counter threads which help to snug everything up when you drive them all the way in. I will be putting links in the description to all of the products used in this project, so feel free to take a look at that down below. Once you've got that first row in, use that spacer, and a little tip here is to use your leg or your knee to push the deck board firmly against the spacer, and once you've got the first screw driven in, you can release the pressure and drive the second. Now basically I would take that spacer, move it every 2 or 3 joists just to get nice consistent spacing there, fasten that in each place, and then once that was in place I can not worry about the spacer anymore, and then go through and fill in all of the joists between. Be sure to use 2 screws per joist and everything will stay on very securely. Another tip that you'll want to keep in mind is that the manufacturer's end is usually not square, as you can see here. So if you are going to use the end of a board, be sure to cut that off with your square. That'll also get rid of the staples or labels that you find on those manufacturing ends. So from here, I'm just following the pattern that I showed earlier, and this is really just that wash, rinse, repeat part that we talked about a few minutes ago. Once you've got everything done there, the exciting part is when you get the whole thing clad and decking and you're able to start doing some cutoffs. So I used my jigsaw to follow that outside pattern, which was a little bit tricky trying to figure out exactly how to do that. But it worked out, and it's actually really gratifying doing this last part where you really start to see the deck take shape. I ended up with several little missing teeth, as it were, over on that right side. I left those open knowing that I would have some cutoffs that I could use to fill that area in. So it was just a matter of applying those and then again cutting them flush with the rest of the cut. Now at this point it was starting to get dark, but I was so close I just had to finish, so I grabbed some of the boards, brought them over, and I used clamps to help hold them in place while I fastened them to the joists. Now keep in mind you can purchase 8 or 12 inch wide pieces, which would make this job a lot easier, but I already had these boards so I figured I'd use them. And in the end, this is how it came out. I'm actually super pleased with how this deck looks. I love that it's custom fit to the shape of the rock wall and the terrace that we have, and really just is a great gathering place. One of the things that surprised us most is how much we use this deck. We're out there all the time. We spend a lot of time there. We love doing marshmallows outside and s'mores, and it's really just a great gathering place. But one of the first things we noticed after just a couple of uses was that we really wanted some shade on there. So we put together some cables across the fence and the house, strung up some string lights, and then put some 12x16 shade sails over top, and that made a huge difference, but a little bit ghetto. There's my trusty yellow level holding up that shade sail in the middle, sitting on top of the fireplace, but it works. So with that, I started actually on a design for a pergola. I found some designs online that I thought were really cool, but there's a few things about them that I just didn't quite like. So I designed my own in SketchUp and actually sent them to a machine shop to have them fabricated there. And once I got those back, I was ready to start building this very simple and modern pergola. I used some 4x4 pieces of redwood and cut everything to size. I had to do some sanding to fit them into the brackets that were fabricated, but within a matter of a couple of hours, I was able to get the pergola set up. I made sure to fasten all of the brackets to the boards and then fasten the brackets to the deck itself as well. We took those same 12x16 shade sails and ended up with this as the final product.
Now, as promised, I wanted to talk about those 3 things that I really took away from this project that I think you'll appreciate. Now, the first lesson is a mistake that I made by putting my tough blocks in this case, or your pier blocks if you use those, too close to the outside edge. As you can see here, I actually ended up putting some so close to the edge that I had to custom cut the skirt around them, which I really don't appreciate the look of. Luckily, that's on the side that gets seen the least, and so it's not a huge deal, but I definitely would do that differently next time. So make sure you give yourself some space and pull those foundation blocks in a little bit. Now, my second lesson learned is tough blocks themselves. I did a lot of research before starting on the deck, and I was going to use concrete pier blocks, which is a pretty traditional method for building a floating deck like this. But the tough blocks have a couple of main advantages. Number one, by far the best advantage is that they're light. I can grab a whole box of them, enough to do this entire deck, and carry it no problem. Try doing that with cement pier blocks. They weigh usually about 40 pounds each, and it's just really heavy. So they do a great job. Both of them do a really great job, but as far as convenience to work with, tough blocks definitely win out. Now, my final lesson that I wanted to share is that shade really matters. If you want to get good use out of your floating deck, then you'll want to put up some shade. I found that when we didn't have the shade up, yes, it was fun to come out here, but when it was really warm, it just wasn't as enjoyable. And this is kind of a common sense, no duh sort of thing, but it really made a huge difference to have this. But you'll definitely want to put some sort of shade up so that you can enjoy the floating deck at any point of the day. For behind the scenes access, as well as to find out what kind of projects are going on in between these bigger projects, be sure to follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Learn2DIY. And if you're interested in some really cool swag and some extra plans for the projects that I build, you can follow me on Patreon as well. While you're looking at outdoor projects, I've got another video series that I think you're going to really enjoy. I want to show you how I built this treeless treehouse, or our clubhouse, right back here. I put together a 3-video series where I'll show you everything from doing the foundation, the framing, the actual cladding that goes around the outside, the roofing, the whole 9 yards. So be sure to check that video series out right here.